So what we did last time, so far, recap, we talked about, in our introduction,
Terms.
we talked about the mind of Christ, so having the mind of Christ as the basis for the study. We talked about conforming versus transforming and how the world is very me-centered and self-centered, and Christ calls us to be other-centered without neglect to ourselves. That's not saying we just forget about ourselves. That's not. We talked about terms and definitions. Then we talked about generosity and transformed community, and looking at the gleaning laws in the Old Testament and Jewish traditions and the teachings. Specifically the gleaning laws in Deuteronomy 24, and we saw how that played out in Ruth, so it was something that they practiced. And so we talked about how the gleaning laws and generosity were related, and then we got to the talk about koinonia, and if you were to look at it's basically trying to get us to say, look at what the early church was like, and let's try and replicate that, duplicate it. Yeah, let's do it off that. And so last time we said you had homework, which was to read the stories that transform and learning about the characteristics of the early church. So I do want to start there. I do want to look at some of those things. So let's go to Acts chapter 2. Does anyone need a Bible?
Probably Michael.
Acts chapter 2, verses 41 to 47. This is page 10.
In the packet, right?
Yes, not in the Bible. That would be Genesis.
Yours is set up differently than mine.
You want me to read it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Acts 2, verse 41 through 47. Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved.
Anything stick out to you in that passage?
There's a lot of community going on,
Yeah.
and they sound very happy.
Sharing, you know, and they shared what they had.
And there was enough,
Mm-hmm.
But why was there enough?
because God
You
provided.
God provides.
God provides, and God used some people, right? Verse 45, they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. So in the church, if you had a need, the people in the church provided for you. That was the form of extreme generosity that occurred in the early church. And churches do replicate that today as well. I don't know to that same extent of selling all of my possessions and giving to someone else, but the acts of generosity is something that we are called to replicate in our lives as Christians. This is the floor plan that the early church has set up for us to mimic as we continue to grow as the body of Christ as well. And this is radical generosity. Radical generosity. Let's also look at Acts 4, 32 to 37. Would someone like to read that?
I can.
Okay.
All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet.
Yeah, so it's very, so not even just in one chapter, we have two chapters, two stories talking about giving us a revelation about how the early church interacted with itself. Are these things that, what would be easy to replicate, what would be harder to replicate in our day and age?
Selling the house.
Yeah, I was thinking, it take weeks and
Selling the
weeks.
house.
Liquidating your assets.
Yeah.
If liquidating your assets would be harder, what would take it? What would it take for them? What do you think is the cause of them being able to say, you know what, I'm just going to sell my plot of field and give it laid at the disciples' feet? What would be the reason? How would they be empowered to do that?
The Holy Spirit.
Because that's not something that anyone just does, right? People don't just sell their possessions and give it to everyone else.
Well, they didn't think they needed it, you know, because their security lay elsewhere, and they expected Jesus to come back
They did.
pretty soon.
hmm
They weren't anticipating a 2,000-year wait. They thought Jesus was, his second coming was imminent.
So what you're saying is they didn't need their 401k so much.
Exactly, right. Didn't matter if they had $1 million or not.
Well,
They
in
didn't believe they did.
verse 33, it says with great power. So I like to think that the power of the Lord was also upon them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were blessed because of the way they were treating each other. And so I think one of the things that's a lesson for the church is the way we treat each other is the way God treats us. Whether or not good or bad, I think God leads us to our own devices when we try and devour each other. And we see that all throughout the scriptures. And God blesses the folks when they are doing what they're supposed to as well. Not to say that God can't bless those who devour each other. Still, we see that in the scriptures as well. People who are evil and do bad things they get the sunshine on them too, and people will complain about that in the scriptures. But for the most part, if we are treating ourselves one way, what do we expect?
In today's world, what I was thinking when you were talking was that we have that additional insight of what we call God's time. And so it's like so many other things in my mind with Christianity, a two-edged sword. So we don't have, we know that back then they thought one thing about the second coming. Now we know nobody knows the day or the time or whatever. But then that's a different kind of a motivation to do the kind of things that you're showing us here in the scripture, because the need may be there for a long, long time, if not for those same people, for another generation. So the Spirit moves us, maybe for different reasons, to do similar things if we're going to support people in our churches.
Yeah. So what's that?
But I find that, you know, when you share, you always have enough for yourself. You know, the more you share, the more you have to share.
So what are the ways in which we can include the gleaning process of Deuteronomy in our lives, in our context? Are there ways in which we do it already? Are there ways in which we can become better at it?
I think one of the ways is not to spend every dime of your income. That you need to make sure that you put aside money for missions in the church. Oftentimes that needs to be first and not, you know, pay your bills and then whatever's left over. I think sometimes we account for there is no margin, and we account for we overburden ourselves with debt, or what, we overextend ourselves. So I think that's one way you can not glean everything. I think, for example, during the recent pandemic, not buying every pack of toilet paper. I mean, seriously, if you don't need 48 rolls, leave some for your brother.
That's right.
And I do think sometimes, even we saw that with the recent gas shortage. I mean, you might have had a half a tank, but you still went and topped it off. I mean, you know, it's just, we get into this scarcity mentality.
We do.
Or like sometimes us being small as a church, there have been a few times where we've said, that's a big project. But then again, we are reminded, usually somebody on the committee will speak up and say, God has always provided, and it doesn't stop us from trying, you know? I mean, there have been many times we've made efforts, and it's amazing, well, maybe it isn't amazing knowing our God, but how our little loaves and fishes got so multiplied. I mean, you know, that time we started out with just a few shoes and we ended up with over 70 pairs, or Lord knows how much toothpaste we got out there right now.
Yeah. So let's go to page 14 and go on to session 3. Inclusion transforms communities. So what we've been doing is we are reading paragraph by paragraph the opening so that we're all on the same page on the ground level what they're trying to convey to us, and we go clockwise. So I'll go first, and Eleanor, and so forth. Or you know what? Eleanor, you go first. Let's change things up.
Where do you want me to start?
Page 14 at the top.
They're not paged.
They are on the side. You see that blue number?
Oh, I do see,
Not where you think it would be.
I'm looking at it on the bottom. Okay, God's transforming community has the mind of Christ and accomplishes God's purpose in at least 2 ways: through radical acts of inclusion and by resisting conformity to this world's practices of exclusion and bureaucracy of privilege.
Or greed as well.
The first century Mediterranean world in which Jesus, Paul, and Luke lived was ordered according to an honor-shame system. Honor had to do with the value of one's social status, and people considered it a commodity more important to possess than material wealth. If born into a family of prestigious lineage, one came into the world with honor. If one acted courageously, made a generous gesture, or generally met society's expectations of conformity, honor was acquired. All social transactions were conducted with the currency of honor, but it was considered to be of limited supply. One person's acquisition of honor required someone else's loss. There was a definite social hierarchy, and the vast majority of people were nearer to the bottom. They were excluded because they had no honor to trade, having been shamed by lowly birth, poverty, social standing, slave status, or affliction.
Meals provided especially good opportunities to both flout one's honor, and to secure it by inviting guests of high status. In this session's Bible story from Luke 14, Jesus is a dinner guest at the home of a Pharisee when he tells the parable of the wedding banquet. As leaders in the religious community, Pharisees studied the scriptures and taught the people how they should be applied in daily life. Jesus is invited to a meal with Pharisees, showing that while often portrayed as antagonistic toward Jesus, the Pharisees actually recognized him as a worthy interpreter of the scriptures and as having some status among the people.
The first half of the parable, Luke 14, 7-10, perfectly illustrates how the honor-shame system works. In fact, Jesus even seems to be giving the Pharisees some very good advice for how best to navigate the honor-shame system, suggesting they make calculated gestures of lowliness for the sake of securing a measure of honor.
That is until verse 11, where instead of encouraging conformity to the social system, Jesus appends it by speaking instead of humility and exaltation. Immediately we hear echoes of Paul's letter to the Philippian Christians. Jesus humbled himself in obedience unto death, and then is highly exalted as Lord of all. When Jesus explains his parable with these particular words, the currency of social transactions based on honor at the expense of others is transformed to self-emptying love for the benefit of others.
This parable is not just a cautionary tale about thinking too highly of ourselves, lest we be publicly put in our place, nor is it establishing a new rule of Christian etiquette. Instead, Jesus is challenging the religious community's conformity to the world's hierarchies of privilege, which by nature are exclusive, and calling it to be transformed in God's system of love, which by nature is inclusive. Jesus challenges the religious community to see itself in all human relationships through God's eyes and with renewed minds, the mind of Christ.
This is clear in the last half of the parable, verses 12 to 14. Jesus turns his attention to the host who has honor to allocate and who has calculated what more he can acquire with the guest list of high status invitees. Jesus asks the host to relinquish his claim to honor, to voluntarily disengage from a system designed to secure his own standing, and to be an agent of change. Jesus asks him to spend his honor instead on those with no capacity to return it, inviting into his circle and celebratory banquet those who have no social capital for repayment. The poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, emptying himself of his coffers of honor and humbling himself in the honor-shame system, the host will be exalted in the economy of God.
The Christian community is one that does not conform itself to the world's hierarchies of status and privilege, but rather transforms itself in loving inclusion of all. And when people see such a community active in the world, they are witnessing a community transformed with the mind of Christ.
So do you glean anything from this page, this beginning statement?
Well, I found in the third last verse on the beginning page where it says, the currency of social transaction.
Mhm.
Well, I thought that was a unique way of putting it. That you expend it.
Mhm.
You know, either you have little or you have lots or somewhere in between. But the currency, I thought that was an interesting word to use for that. Currency.
And it's because you're using it, your honor, to try and get more honor. Kind of like, instead of buying stocks and bonds, you try and exchange your honor in the social system to climb higher and higher. And the lower you are in the status of the hierarchy of the social system, the harder it is to climb to the top. But the more your birthplace gives you a certain amount of honor to begin with, to exchange and play with. I mean, you can lose your honor by doing things, but it's harder to climb that social hierarchy, especially if you look at the way ancient Rome and ancient Greece and how they had like the Senate and the senators, and if you were born to this house or that house, you had power, and if you were born here, you did, and that's around the same time, and so that's the way it worked. They had a social economy, and we have our own social economy too, with people are born in different places. Like, if I'm the son of a president, I may have more honor than other people, and people may look at me greater than others just because I'm the son of the president.
Well, I think it's interesting, you know, we can draw parallels and kind of figure out what our status measurement looks like today. But I think what I glean from this story is that there are folks who are really treating all of those interactions as an exchange. And I'm sure there are folks who are still doing that today, and I'm sure there are church folks who do that and churches who do that. You know, really kind of performative rather than acting from the, you know, generosity and love that's in their hearts. And I think what I'm what I get from this story is kind of recognizing that those who don't have anything, those situations and circumstances where we can be life-giving, without having to take a picture of it and post it on social media, doing it for the actual good of that person rather than for the pat on the back about it.
I don't think we, in this day and age, really can appreciate what this status hierarchy is in terms of what they call in this article honor and your standing. But we're all familiar with the stories of the Apostle Paul and the fact that his being a citizen of Rome was a big deal. And that it was a far bigger deal than how much money he had as a son of a tent maker. Even if he was a relatively successful business family, that was far less important than that status as a Roman citizen. And I forget where it is in the Bible where he writes that he was born a Roman citizen, whereas someone else, I think it was a soldier, Roman soldier, had to buy his, because you could buy your citizenship then. But the things, the rights and privileges that came in that system were huge. And in our society, at least on paper, we try to have more mobility between classes here, and it's a lot more based on economic standing here. But the idea of what some of those things meant then it's harder for us to understand or appreciate how important that was and how inflexible it could be.
One of the things that really sticks out to me is how we as men, as people, can be very prideful. You have the story of the disciples who were saying who's going to sit on the left and who's going to sit on the right, and we too can be very, very. My daddy used to call it full of yourselves, and how that contrasts so much with the example of Jesus, who humbled himself. We heard not too long ago in the Tuesday Bible study when we were talking about the crucifixion, how when they came for him, he identified himself, he went with them, he didn't push against them. I mean, he basically said, here I am, and surrendered himself. And how humble he was, we saw throughout his ministry, and how that's, I think, something we aspire to, but how it's so different from how we in our humanness, our first response is to be prideful.
And most of the early church are not people who have high status. Most of the early church are low status people in the society. Remember when we did that Matthew study, we learned about he spoke mostly to the people of the land, and that was the term for the lower social status folks who Jesus appealed to the most.
And who did the angels come to?
That's right.
The shepherds. The low, the name of low.
Which shows you, as long, even in the time of Christ, there have been these classes and the haves and the have-nots. So we haven't really evolved that much.
And it happened all throughout the world. Remember, we'll do a study on ancient cosmology, study of how people think about the creation of the world, and how, if you were in Babylon, you would use a creation story to show how you were better than everyone else. And so people are always trying to have social standing. Why is it? Well, I'm the king and I was appointed by these deities, so I'm greater than everyone else and you have to listen to me. Let's go to biblical images. We are going to, they want us to look at 3 passages in Isaiah. So the first passage is from Isaiah, whose prophecies significantly influenced the spiritual imaginations of Jesus, the Gospel by Luke, and the Apostle Paul. Isaiah writes at a time when many leaders of Israel had been exiled for years in the country of Babylon. And while in exile, the Israelites' religious beliefs and practices drew many non-Israelites to faith in God. And the prophet also saw how the nations were also God's instruments and servants. Isaiah's prophecies celebrate God's freedom to embrace all people as God's people. So in these prophecies, Isaiah challenges Israel's belief that it was to be the sole recipient of God's favor and paints a new picture of God's plan for salvation as intended for all people, for Israel, yes, but also for the rest of humanity. So let's look at these passages. Let's start with Isaiah 58, verses 2 through 12, and we'll just do them all together because we are a small group. So Isaiah chapter 58, verses 2 through 12. Isaiah is before Jeremiah.
And isn't there some thought that 3 people wrote Isaiah? That the style of writing and it changes? No.
That there's 3 books to Isaiah. I'm not fully versed in that, but yes, based on the style of writing, that they would believe that Isaiah is broken as 3 different books at least, yes. So let's go Isaiah 58, verses 2 through 12. I will read this one. Yet day after day they seek me. Well, I might as well just start with 1. Shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interests on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down and the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose water never fails. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. So what is the message of Isaiah 58, 2 through 12?
To be sincere.
To be sincere. Would you expand on that?
Well, he talks about your fasting, but he kind of says, are you really fasting? You know, you're doing this and this and this, and this isn't true and
You
sincere.
have to be humble. You have to humble yourself in what you do. You're not doing that just to show off, but you're doing it because God tells you to do it.
And you're doing
You
it
know?
sincerely and with your intent.
Yeah.
And in a transformative way, to kind of transform your heart and your intention to humility. It's not just about the act of bowing your head or the act of not eating food, but the kind of why behind it.
Yeah.
The motive. I think you told us not too long ago in one of your sermons. It had to do with, there was the manner, the motive, and there was a third M in which you did something. Do you remember that, the 3 M's, the manner and the motive?
I do not remember. But yeah, the motive matters. The nature of their heart matters, because God is not just saying, okay, I'll be happy if you do these fasts. No, it's not the fact that you fast, it's the fact that your heart is also pure too. Because God's like, how can you fast and ask me to do something and you're oppressing all these people? If anything, I'm going to listen to the prayers of these people to overthrow you and get you out of here so that they can be taken care of. And yet,
Yeah, but Pastor, don't you think sometimes, depending on where you are in your walk as a Christian, that there are days your motive and your intent is sincere, and then there's some days you're just putting one foot in front of the other?
there are.
I think there are times, especially I think if you're hurting or you're in the pit or you're in a dark season, maybe you're saying the Apostles' Creed or you're praying the model prayer.
I would say, what does the testimony of your life look like?
Okay, life being a span of period, not just a day here and there.
Correct.
I think you hit on something that's very important, because is that not why God sent Christ to save us? Because we can't do those things ourselves. We can do it for a while, we can do it here and there, we can rise to occasions, but this passage just shows how, other times we don't, as you were saying, we go through a bad patch, we have bad days, so yeah, we can't, I think that illustrates, that's why I say it's such an important prophet, right? But what's in our heart, all those things matter, but what's in our heart isn't pure, and so,
Mm-hmm.
You sort of wax and wane.
yeah.
Yeah. It kind of goes with the message from last week and this week. Moving past our labels. So like, they have done these things, but as a country, as a people, they can move past this label of oppressor to someone who is caring for God's people and live into that identity and not live down to how they were acting as a people. And so we can all learn and grow. This may be a period in my life where I'm not living the way I need to be. And I can grow from that, and I can learn from it and move past that into someone that God is calling, living closer to my calling than I may have done in the past.
Well, we saw that a lot in the Psalm study. When you're in the period of disorientation, you kind of aren't plugged in.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of what's going through my head when I read the parched bones. Because earlier when we were reading, it reminded me of, this could be likened to the story of the sower, where he casts and casts, and it doesn't really matter where it lands, where it's going to grow is the mattering. It reminded me of, what our talk here has been. It just sunk into me. I thought about when you have a pot that you've had a season of growth in, and then you don't maintain that pot. I put it in the garage. Well, what happens to it after that? It's bone dry. And there's no replenishing that bone dry soil. It takes a process to make it rehydrate, and it's a matter of soaking that pot in a bucket of water and pouring more and more and more till that's recent. And that's about like life. If you keep going and going and going and don't maintain yourself and keep yourself in good soil, it's going to dry out. It's not going to be any good to nobody.
It's the importance of spiritual growth. You have
Staying
to keep
connected.
growing and staying connected.
Staying watered.
And I also see that even though you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G right in a row, and you just keep the law, doesn't mean that you're loving anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And because when it says it's not just the fast, he's saying that even though you're doing what is called for, it's still not, your heart's not in the right place.
Not sincere.
Because they're fasting. What does God say is the fast I want? The fast that I choose is to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke. Because God is about liberating. God wants everyone to live to their fullest potential. God is a God of justice, and so injustice is the opposite of God. And so God comes out to destroy injustice. And that's why he complains to Israel about all the time. You are doing X, Y, and Z. You're oppressing the people. Why does Solomon lose the throne and he falls out of grace with God? The Bible says because he not just has a bunch of wives, but because he used forced labor to build everything. And so that's his fault too. And here, the people are, and we saw this in our minor prophet studies, how the reason why they get cast into exile is because of all the injustice and oppression that they do as a people.
But it takes a lot of humility and discernment and honesty with yourself to admit these things. And man by nature
No.
isn't a humble, discerning, honest with myself, being. It's just not our nature.
And so
And that's why I guess we have to continue to ask God to help us.
And so that's why it's a process of renewing our minds and renewing ourselves. We are a new creation, but we still fight again with the old creation. And that's where, as we grow in spiritual maturity, it makes it more often than not we'll win instead of lose that fight.
I think some of our prayers during our worship service, the things I've done or not done, and I always think, what didn't I do? Or the people that I loved and I haven't, or unloved, where you're on this side of the coin, then you're on that side of the coin. And it's very convicting to say those words.
And it's hard to admit when we do something wrong. So we talk about the introspective part in the sermon today, that it's hard to be introspective and say, okay, where do I need to work on? Because we always need to work on something. But we know that God, that it's not a question of are we called to justice. The question is how we live out that justice. What does that mean for each of us as individuals? How do we live out the call to loose the bonds of injustice? Remember, when Jesus comes, that's what he says. He's coming. Luke 4, it's part of this is in that. It's not exactly this one, but I've come to set the captives free, to bring sight to the blind and help the lame walk, and all those things are all about liberating from things that have held you back as a person, especially in these societies that they were in. If you were blind, that's almost as good as a death sentence. There's not a lot of help for you. If you were deaf, mute, you most likely can't provide for yourself as much. And so, if you were an orphan, and so we've had these scriptures the past 3 sessions to talk about this. So let's go to Isaiah 56 passage, verses 1 through 8. And this is the second passage that has said that blessings can be tied to how you treat people. That if you are treating people poorly, then I may not hear your prayers. I may not hear these things. That God that's a possibility. And we have to be able to face that. So 56, 1 through 8. Would someone like to read that?
Thus said the Lord, maintain justice and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come, and my deliverance be revealed. Happy is the mortal who does this, the one who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and refrains from doing any evil. Do not let the foreigner join to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus says the Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, I will gather others to them besides those already gathered.
What do you hear from this passage?
Well, I thought it was interesting in verse 3 where the eunuch, and let not any eunuch complain, I'm only a dry tree. That made me think of your message last Sunday and today. I'm only the person who failed English. I'm only the woman who has bled for many, many years. I find myself sometimes now when I'm volunteering at places and I have to talk to a potential customer, I'll say, I'm only a volunteer. And then I remind myself that I'm discounting myself. I'm only a volunteer.
Well, I don't know if you're necessarily discounting yourself. You're just admitting your limitations.
Well, the word only to me implies lowly or not of value, you know.
I think that what I get from this is actually that's how we Gentiles get into the promise. This is I see as the opening of that passageway for us, because to the Jews or the Hebrews, whichever they called themselves at this time, the Israelites, they had their covenant, their promise. They weren't thinking about expanding it to foreigners, and eunuchs were not people. That was a good example. People were not held in high esteem, 800 BC. So there's something for us here to kind of cling to.
And to kind of expand upon that, because we've been welcomed by God into this space, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to hold the door open for others in our places of worship.
I thought also what came to mind in talking was that when the Israelites or whoever would go to a different land, do not take wives, so that would be excluding. That would not be, like they're almost saying, oh, there's no hope. You can't convert them, they'll just sway you away. And so that kind of gives you, where's the happy medium? Or are you supposed to be welcoming, or you're supposed to stay away from bad temptation. So.
And was it Abraham or was it Moses that wanted to take their people and let's live outside wherever separate so that they wouldn't have to be with the non-Israelites folks? Was that Abraham?
I don't know what you're
Moses.
talking about, but I would need a little bit more context. I think we have to understand the connection between the divine judgment on the Canaanites when we talk about don't take a wife or don't do this, don't do that, that has occurred because of the ways in which they are treating people as well. And so they have the same divine judgment that comes on the world at the flood is the same divine judgment that is connected to the Canaanites, the people who are in the land as well. We can do a study on that too if you want. I may just cover it in the Genesis study, but there is a connection to God's divine judgment of the people of Canaan that is carried out.
To me, the foreigners are the ones that, Gentile, whatever you want to call us, foreigners, Gentiles, whatever, they are the ones, first of all, they have to accept Christ. And then, we accept people, but they also have to accept Christ. And that's what this is saying. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord.
Yeah, so everyone is included. So how would the foreigner be able to even know about the Lord?
You would have had them in
They have to be told.
You have to be told, and you have to be
Shown.
deemed worthy enough to even hear the message of God. And the people would have to live into their calling of sharing who God is. And they would have had to heard about, remember, put yourself into their worldview. God, the God of Israel, is the God of Israel. So unless the people are accepting them into Israel and taking care of them, it's going to be hard for someone to just accept the God of Israel as one that is good, because the God of Israel is a reflection of the people. And so if the people are terrible and bad, then they won't follow the God of Israel. But if the people are treating you well, it's a reflection not on you, it's a reflection on the God of your nation.
And I think that's the same thing as our witness as Christians.
Yes.
There are lots of folks who will say, I'm not going to church, I'm not going to be a Christian because this is what Christians do, this is how Christians have treated me, and I don't want to be a part of that club. You know, I don't want to be that way. From what I hear about Jesus, Jesus is cool and whatever, but you people don't treat people like Jesus did.
That's Gandhi's famous quote. I like your Jesus, but I don't your people who just don't act like him.
Yeah, and so I think we have that's part of our charge, our call as well, to be image bearers, to be witnesses to the God that we love and we serve.
Yeah. So we have to end because it's 9:50. We will continue this session next time, so it's that page 18, I think. So it's going to take us probably more than 6 sessions, but that's not surprising anyone.